I'd like to share a story about how Ellen White worked for a church leader. It's a church leader that probably most Seventh-day Adventists have heard about. His name was Uriah Smith. For many years, Elder Smith was editor of our church paper. He was known as the author of Thoughts on Daniel and Revelation. He was a poet. He was an inventor. In other words, he did a lot for this church, but on occasion, Elder Smith would get on the wrong side of things. Back in about 1881, 1882, there was a controversy in the newly opened Battle Creek College. The president of the school, or they called him principal then, the principal of the school thought we shouldn't have very many rules for the students, and that the rules we did have we shouldn't enforce. And Elder Smith agreed with the principal. On the other side was the president of the General Conference, G.I. Butler, and he thought we should have a lot of rules and we should enforce them rigorously or vigorously. And the head of the English department also agreed. So you could see there was a controversy. And it got so bad they had to close the college for a whole year till things had calmed down and they could decide. They got a new principal and they could decide how they wanted to proceed. Well, then came Minneapolis, the great Righteousness by Faith General Conference session. And again, Elder Smith, this man who contributed so much to our church, Elder Smith was on the wrong side of things. He was not one of those that easily accepted the new insights into righteousness by faith. And this bothered Ellen White because her heart had responded to the messages of Elders Jones and Wagner, and she herself had been teaching some of these things for quite some time before. And so here to have this man who had contributed so much on the wrong side, and she tried to reach out to him. After the session, back in Battle Creek, he didn't want to even talk to her. And this troubled Ellen White. On December 31, 1890, she tried to reach out one more time to this man. He was editor of the paper at the time. So this is not someone who's gotten unhappy and gone off by himself. He's still editor of the paper. And she sat down. The letter was 12 typewritten pages, double-spaced typewritten pages. And I want to just read a few lines so you get some feel for what she said to Elder Smith and the intensity under which she worked when she was burdened on behalf of a soul. And then I want to tell you the good part of the story is what was Elder Smith's response. She started her letter, "Dear Brother Smith, I have been remarkably exercised in regard to your case several times during my last round of labors. I have been greatly blessed of the Lord, but at times your case has been presented before me in a very clear light, just where you are standing. I have carried the burden with but little hope that I could do you any good." Well, of course, he wouldn't even talk to her. So how could she do him much good? Then she reviews some of the things going back to when the college had to be closed and talks to him about Minneapolis. And then she comes back to her appeal. "I am sorry that you are affected with defective spiritual eyesight." Now that's strong language. And she's writing, the prophet's writing to the editor of the paper, "I beg of you for your soul's sake to buy of the heavenly merchantman gold that ye may be rich, white raiment that ye may be clothed, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve that thou mayest see." And then she refers to some more things that have happened, and she comes back again to her appeal. "My brother Uriah Smith, whom I have loved and respected in the Lord, you have been working at cross purposes with God, practicing upon yourself deceptions which, if you continue as you have done, will be succeeded with deceptions and delusions which will end in irrevocable separation from God." She could not be clearer. If you do not change, you will be lost. And she writes to him some more, talking to him about Jesus and what he's done. "Without me, said Christ, ye can do nothing. Do you refuse to fall on the rock? If so, there is not the slightest assurance in your case that you will ever recover yourself out of the snare of the devil." She writes a little bit more, and then she comes to her conclusion. Well, she's still 2 pages from the conclusion, but let me just read a few more lines. "Why your particular case agonizes my soul so continuously, I cannot define. Again and again have I seen the blindness was upon you to an alarming degree. I give you up to the hands of Jesus, and then think I have not more to say, not another word, Then I find my soul torn with anguish, and I am weeping and praying with strong cryings and tears. Take not thy Holy Spirit from him. Oh, let something from thy Spirit break this spell. Now, when Ellen White was working for a soul, this is the way she would write, strong. There is no way that you can misunderstand. And the tears, there are other places where she talks about the tears falling on the paper as she's writing to the individual. Here it's happening again as she's writing to Elder Smith. Well, what was Elder Smith's response? Actually, Ellen White wrote him another shorter letter a few days later, which is typical also. When she had a real burden for somebody, she'll write him a long letter, the person, man or woman, she'll write them a long letter. And then a few days later, she may write a second. And in our files, sometimes we have a third. I mean, it's like she cannot let go of this soul. She's not going to let them go to Satan. She's going to try everything she knows to keep them on the Lord's side. Well, what was Elder Smith's response? Now, Ellen White did not tell him to do what he did, but he asked if he could come see her. And of course, that's what she wanted to do, wanted to talk with him. And he asked if he could bring along a few church leaders with him. And so he invited the president of the General Conference and a few people like that. And then, as again I repeat, she didn't ask him to do this, but he read every single word of this private testimony in front of the General Conference president and others. And the account is that with tears of repentance and confession, he broke down and acknowledged that he had been wrong. But that was not enough. That was not enough for Elder Smith, because Elder Smith knew he was a church leader, and he knew there was more he needed to do. There was a meeting where there were ministers present going on, and he asked if he could speak to the pastors, and he was given permission. Now, the report is that on this occasion, he did not read the entire testimony. He described it, described that he had received a letter from Ellen White, told something about what was in it, and because he had divided the working force of this church, some had agreed with him, some had disagreed with him, going clear back to the situation with the college. Again, the report is that with tears of repentance and confession, he broke down and wept and begged their forgiveness. But that was not enough for Elder Smith. Because you see, Elder Smith knew he was a church leader, and he had divided not just the working force, the pastors, but he had divided the local congregation. And so he asked if on Sabbath he could speak to the congregation in the large dime tabernacle in Battle Creek. And again, he did not read the testimony. The report is that he described it, and then again with tears of repentance and confession, he begged their forgiveness, apologized, and asked that they forgive him for what he had done and his wrong attitude, and for dividing them also, some agreeing with him, some agreeing with the other side. Was Elder Smith perfect after this? No, of course not. But was he a changed man? I think he was. And let me tell you why. Now remember, Elder Smith worked for the Review, the church paper, for a total of about 50 years, and probably 30 or so of those years he was editor. In 1897, so 7 years after this letter, 6 or 7 years later, the General Conference session of 1897 decided to make a change. Guess who they put in to be editor of the paper? A.T. Jones. A.T. Jones, who of course was so right about righteous by faith, but really had been very rude to Elder Smith in 1888 in Minneapolis, because they disagreed on other things too, like the identification of the 10 toes or the 10 kingdoms or the 10 horns. They agreed on most of them, but one or two they didn't agree on. And Smith, kindly refined gentleman that he was, got up and told them why he thought his identification was correct. And brash Elder Jones got up and said, well, you've heard Brother Smith, but he's all wrong, and he doesn't know what he's talking about. In essence, that's what he said. And here's who they really are. The man that had publicly humiliated Elder Smith, is now made his boss. Now, Elder Smith that year was 65 years of age. He had written a number of books. He had royalties. He had patented some things, so he had money coming from patents. He also had a large house that he rented rooms to students in Battle Creek College. Most of us, if the guy that had, or the person that had belittled us a few years earlier in a public way at a General Conference session became our boss, what would we do? We'd quit. What did Elder Smith do? He continued on. In 1901, they decided, the General Conference session in 1901, they decided to put Elder Smith back in as editor. And when Elder Smith died 2 years later, as he collapsed as he was walking to the office, he was editor. My point is that God worked through Ellen White to help change a man who contributed much to this church. And the evidence is that his life did change, and he was a different person after receiving the testimony from Ellen White.